I am happy to have you on our Casual Conversations show. And this is a show that we came from Brain Injury Professional magazine. And we're talking today about research from women from domestic violence and women in the prison system. And before we start on that, I wanted to know if you would tell us a little bit about what in your past created the interest that carried on to the career that you have today.
Yeah. Okay. So I grew up in Wales. So those of you who know Wales, it's a relatively small country next door to England. And I grew up on a farm, and on the farm, I'm not going to go into some singing, but I grew up with two older brothers and a younger sister. And my younger sister, who was 13, 14 years younger than me, so came into our lives, and we were absolutely doting on her. Absolutely lovely little addition. And she was like a rugby ball that we tried to get off each other because she was such a lovely little thing. And we, within about a year or so of her being in the world, we realized that there were some things not developing in the usual kind of way. And about a year and a half, she was diagnosed as having cerebral palsy. And that had been occasioned because of oxygen starvation to the brain during the delivery, because of the protracted kind of labor and so on, and well, what have you. So anyway, so Helen was my sister Helen, and so my sister had these just a lovely, lively sort of way about her, and would kind of notice things, and you could communicate easily, but the language wasn't there so much, and the walking wasn't so much, and so on. And my dad, a farmer, my mum, a teacher, we the house was just turned over to doing things like my dad put together broom handles into these long, like walking kind of frames about the house, so she could wander around, and he re-welded kind of a baby walker into a larger walker, and then a bigger one and a bigger one, as they all kind of evolved into, and so she could wander about the place. And so we kept making adaptations like this. And when she was about 3, we were thinking about schooling, and the educational psychologist so came out to assess Helen for placement and so on. And this must be in early 1980s, and the educational psychologist assessed Helen as not really suitable for schooling, that she had problems cognitively and so on. So she'd be sent away to some special school and so on. And my parents kind of decided, okay, we can go look at the place and see what it's like and so on. And then decided, no, we were just going to we'll be fine. And then within about a year or so, there had been a fair bit of momentum politically, and in the UK. After the Warnock report, there was a greater capacity for kids with disabilities to get to schools. So there was, my mum is wonderful. My dad was wonderful. Well, he died, but anyway, unfortunately. Anyway, so my mum was a bit of a fighter for disability rights, had been previously as well. And so we managed to get Helen into a local school, and could live at home, go to local school and so on. And and would go along, and the guy who would drive her to school, because her farm is really busy, so he needed someone, a neighbour to drive her to school. Bill, that's Cockney. He was lovely, and so after about 6 months or so, she was settling in nicely into the school. And then the educational psychologist came again to see what kind of and maybe to try to convince us to somehow sent Helen away, and retested Helen, and her IQ came back that time as, well, I can imagine something like 150 or something, like off the scale bright, as it were. And the difference between the two times was that on the first occasion, when Helen was 3, her her language was Welsh. Cymraeg. Cymraeg is the word for Welsh. As da chi'n siarad Cymraeg, da chi'n gwybod beth dwi'n sôn dan. If I'm speaking Welsh, you would know I was talking Welsh right now. So it's but in intervening sort of a year and a half, she had learned English from Bill, the Cockney. And her English was good enough to be able to pass the tests. And you remember the draw a man type test, and so she gave half a draw a man test back to the tester and said, "Well, what do you think?" After giving her a handbag and all kinds of stuff, right? So she and Helen's always gone through life with a bit of an interesting, lovely attitude of can-doism that comes along from my dad and my mum, I think. And so she went off. She did well in school, went off to university, got a postgraduate degree, a first in astrophysics, then trained as a journalist and works for the BBC as a senior creative. So that's where she is now. So I guess my starting point was this sort of sense of, well, some psychologists really kind of get it wrong, don't they? If you don't look at the language and the culture and all that kind of stuff, how are you going to understand where the person's coming from? And also, it's so important to look at what kind of resources and family and the response that people have. And disability is something that society creates. It's something that's putting the obstacles in the way of somebody rather than finding the solutions. Sorry, I was just thinking to myself, when Helen learned to drive when she was 17, my daughter turned 17 today. When Helen turned 17, she learned to drive and passed the test. And we got we kind of adapted a vehicle for her. She could use her head to move the stick to do the indicators and stuff. So you got to adapt. You
and your family adapted this for her?
Yeah. Well, as I said, farming,
Right, you figure it out.
Yeah, you figure things out, and you adapt, and you kind of embrace, and you kind of move on. So I guess it's part of so what's interested me, I suppose, was brain systems, how things work, how things develop, and over time, what happens in society to people with a disability, and how can you maybe somehow engage society in a way to try to enable people more. And I guess that's kind of comes from my background.
It's an amazing story. And then what drew you to the prison population?
Complete accident. I'd worked I'd trained in, I'd done a PhD in intellectual disability, then a doctorate in clinical psychology and specializing in neuropsychology.
And before the prisons, where were you working?
I was working at initially in Liverpool, then London and Cambridge, working with Barbara Wilson, as some of you may know, and John Evans at the Oliver Sangle Centre for Brain Injury Rehabilitation in Ely, Cambridge. And that was with people who had car accidents and assaults and so on. So survived brain injury, but then getting back into society. So a lot of the work was I and John and Barbara and others showed how people who have had a brain injury can often have post-traumatic stress disorder, and how you can manage that as well, and how you can get people back into employment, but also into having a family life and into having improved kind of relationships and so on and so forth. Across the spectrum, we did a lot of work. And then I switched to being a university professor, because the research, I was still doing research alongside working clinically. And that was wonderful, working clinically in groups with people with brain injury, so we can understand why you might be impulsive or why you have a memory problem. And you look at the scans and you try to make sense how to manage anger and irritability when your left prefrontal system isn't working effectively. So you need to develop, more in the speech to manage things. So that was wonderful and fascinating. So then I switched to working in academia and at university at Exeter, where I am now. And one of my students was a prison officer, and she asked me if we could do a study on post-traumatic stress in the prisoners. So we showed that about 10 to 20% of people with brain injury have PTSD. So in general, people survive the accident, so they might not remember much about it, but they are stuck with memories to do with the smell or petrol or the touch or something, or these islands of memories and so on. Anyway, so set up a meeting in the prison to go and see if there was a scope for doing a project with the governor and meet some of the prisoners, the inmates. And when I was down there, I had a book coming out as well. So I was there doing some sales, and memory booster workout. And so I did a thing on memory for the prisoners. And one of the prisoners said at the end of my little workshop, "Look, brain doctor, can you explain something to me?" And I've got these wonderful feelings, and it's unusual, isn't it, as a psychologist, to have someone say, "I've got wonderful feelings. Why?" And she said, "Well, I've got these fantastic feelings, and it's just like a trickling of water down the side of my body, and there's this wonderful sensation. So I'm just wondering why." Now I looked at him, and he had prison issue hairstyle, so a crew cut, and I could see on in his head was. The scalp was all intact, but underneath the scalp there was an area of skull missing, and the area of skull missing was over the sensory motor strip over here. And I realized he must have had a head injury, and the flap of bone, well, not put back, or titanium, had not been put back in to protect his brain, and he had been banged up after having a head injury, and he's now in prison and not had any more surgery to fix him up. So what he was doing, why he was having this wonderful sensation, was he was pressing himself on his brain, basically. He was just prodding himself in the brain. So I said, "Look, the reason why you get these sensations is you're prodding yourself in the brain. Stop doing it. It's not good for you. And I urge nobody to do this, right? Just don't do it." And then I realized, and I read a paper by Sina Fassel and others about the dire health a provision for people in prison. I thought, well, this is interesting. These are potentially very vulnerable people. So that was so it tweaked my interest. And then with this prison officer student and others, we did a first study that showed how many people in prison have brain trauma, but the types of brain injuries. So others had found that lots of people in prison have a head injury of some sort, but we showed that 1 or 2 in 10 people in prison have a moderate to severe brain injury, and 3 or 4 people in 10 in prison have mild brain injuries, often repeated and often associated with more violent tendencies, and often also associated with being in prison from a younger age, 16 versus 21. So that then led to more work, because one thing leads to another, right? Mm-hmm. So we then did a similar study in young people in prison. And I was worried, obviously, because one of the problems is that, having worked in brain trauma rehabilitation for quite a while, that people with brain injury have huge amounts of stigma in society, and they have to manage all that stigma, and that stigma turns in and becomes a negative thoughts and all kinds of stuff. So you're like, oh God, we don't want to add towards stigma. And at the same time, we did another study with the young people in prison. In the UK, we have age of criminal responsibility is 10, and young offender units, so prisons for kids, basically, are between 14 and 18 years old of age. And we looked at there were 1,500 in at that time in prison, and we interviewed 200, and we had the response rate of 98%, and we showed 45% had a knockout history, and about 20% had a moderate severe brain injury. Again, same patterns, more. And then we did similar studies that were, another study showed that their post-concussion syndromes were problems with forgetting, feeling irritable, kind of brain fog, all that kind of stuff was much more likely with more dosage of injury, response relationship, not due to drugs and alcohol. Then we showed, recently showed with Hope in the paper that was just down the line, that that the kind of parenting they had was a risk factor for having the head injury in the first place, and then the worst outcomes afterwards as well. So anyway, so we started doing more and more work around teenagers with ending up in prison systems, and finding that there was a lot of them had a brain injury. And then more recently with Bethany Claspy, who's been doing some lovely work, we published a paper showing that many of them had been excluded from school, and having a brain injury was much more associated with having a exclusion history. So school failure in the States, isn't it? So you start off in life with maybe less resources, you have a head injury, and then you get expelled from school or have problems in school, and you then drift around, and then criminal gangs start to utilize you, and then you end up in the system. So that's the tendency. Right. Yeah. And then the worry about the stigma is something maybe I could tell you about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to do that, and then I want to transition to how, at this point, you've been looking at all males at this point?
Yeah. Yes, we were finding it difficult to access any female populations. We were interested in doing that, but it was very hard to get into the female prison population. About 4,000 in the UK women in prison, and 84,000 men and boys. So that's the rates. So yeah, so we hadn't done any. We've been trying to, but we couldn't get anywhere because of the problems in access. So then finally we did, which was interesting. Yeah.
Did you want to the slide that you and I talked about? Did you want to talk about?
Oh yeah, sure. And the first one on the table, I guess that would be useful to come to. Okay, so around the time we started doing the first set of studies with young people in prison. So this is average age 16. We were given a grant by the Children's Commissioner, which is a human rights person for children in the UK. There's 4 of them, one for England, one Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, Northern Ireland and Scotland. And they wanted to know how many kids in custody have neurodisabilities. So we, Nathan Hughes and I and Pratibha Chesapeason, we did this analysis. I think Bethany was on this as well. So this is the rates of neurodisability in the general population, so non-incarcerated youth, and the rates in incarcerated youth. Just bear with me a second, with a side issue, which that I just mentioned. We have by now about 1,000 kids in prison in the UK. In America, in USA, it's 55,000, 55,000. Just bear that in mind when you look at these stats. So on the left, the reported prevalence in the general population, and so let's see, dyslexia 10%, prison population around 50%. ADHD, let's say 5%, depends where you are in the world, 12% kids in custody. Autism spectrum, less than 2%, 15% kids in custody. Brain injury, elevated 2 to 3 times, depending. Fetal alcohol, massively elevated. But the one that's really comes out is communication disorders, speech and language. I'm hoping that there's speech and language kind of people on this call. Communication disorders is your telltale sign that something's not right in development. So not good at following instructions, not good at picking up the cues, emotional cues as well as verbal cues. So poor pragmatics. So 70% plus of kids who end up incarcerated have these kind of problems. So I mentioned earlier that I was worried about the stigma aspect. So it's good that the Children's Commissioner was able to pick this up and able to get policymakers to be interested and start to think about, well, look, our prison population of young people are full of kids with neurodisability. We need to do something different, which led down the line or contributed to my friend Howard Jasper, who's in charge of the health of kids in custody, that we should change the services to be not sort of mini prisons for kids with a bit of schooling to become therapeutic environments. So that's one of the big goals at the moment, to create therapeutic environments for these very distressed kids. And the other thing that happened by sheer luck, really, and was that I had a friend who's a journalist on Radio 4 here in the UK, Radio 4, BBC Radio 4, who does a program all in the mind and various things. And I asked her for advice on, I was worried about our data. I was worried that I would add towards the stigma of people with brain injury. So what to do about this kind of thing, how to get the message across. So she asked me on the program and to explain the data. So I did. So I did what I've just done now and explained. You kind of look at the level of neurodisability in this population, brain injury being a particularly problematic aspect in language. And the next day, the Guardian newspaper, the very liberal newspaper here, came out with an article saying, "Oh my God, it's awful. There's so many kids with neurodisabilities in the prison system. More needs to be done about it." And which is great, but so they were already converted clearly. The Daily Mail, which is our the newspaper of choice for the people who don't really want to change their opinions, usually, maybe. The Daily Mail ran the story saying, "So many vulnerable kids in prisons. Who would have thought it? This is terrible. Need to do something different." So it was quite nice or neat in a way to be able to see a media representation be taken up sensitively, and the story then becoming something that the politicians could actually grapple with. So then kind of it became more and more possible to work with politicians. So I've done a lot of work in Parliament with various bodies to try to get this onto their agenda, which is why, to some extent, with wonderful colleagues, I must say, that things have changed, because the politicians could then be more mindful of the neurodisabilities that are important in understanding crime. So, so mantras like, "Oh, we're going to be tough on crime." Well, yeah, but what about the reasons why people offend? It's often because there's adversity. It's often because there are drug-taking issues, because you have that trauma and the brain injury and they're going, "Oh, hang on." And our current prisons minister, he thinks attachment theory and all that is wonderful. He wants to really see change happening around this. So, it's important. Anyway, so you might want to move on to the next slide.
On this now, were these males and females, or just males in this one?
This is it's largely males, because most of these populations would have been male, but sometimes there's a smattering of female population in there too. Yeah, but same here. This is largely male. Pittman, Fishbein, Ray, and Richardson. So effectively, what you find in adults in prisons or people with brain injury who are in prison, you find that there's problems with poorer engagement in services. Who would have thought it? My God! Well, you've got problems with understanding, maybe language and, planning, and then more infractions and higher level of convictions and more violence. So on the out, when people are leaving prison, it's harder for them to generalize what they've learned, the anger management skills. So you remember earlier I said about Oliver Sangwell Center, where I was helping people to develop their skills. Well, it's possible to really help people manage, being in charge. Do you want to move on to the next slide? And so with the Disabilities Trust, which is a charity here in the UK that works a lot in brain trauma, we had a grant from the Barrow Cadbury Trust, from the Cadbury chocolates, to look at whether women in prison, women and girls, young women and also tend to have kind of brain trauma. And so this and another study I was involved with, we found that there was this is Sylvia Ramos and Ivan Pittman and various other people were leading on this, and I was a consultant, showed that about 60% of women in prison had brain injury histories. Some of their worst brain injuries were in the early 20s, so late teens, early 20s. One of the main causes was domestic violence. And so, and they're in prison for things that are not paying, license for TV or, lots of things like that. Anyway, so in the next study, this is from, if you want to go to the next slide. This is another study we published, I think, a month or so ago with Amanda Kirby from the Do It Profile solution. So the Do It Profiler is developed in schools and colleges to give people a readout of whether you've got problems with attention, communication, concentration, and so on. And so she started to get asked to put this into a prison system to see if people had the telltale signs of cognitive problems and how to then maybe help people rehabilitate in prison. Anyway, so Amanda has been doing sterling work, and in this study with women in prison in Scotland, this study, we found, if you want to go to the next slide, we found that effectively that we're able to break people skills levels down into whether they had good skills, reasonable skills, many challenges, significant challenges, and the 1 and 2 level there, challenges and significant challenges, are the kinds of composite problems people have. So they've grown up maybe with maybe some social communication problem, maybe a little bit autistic continuum kind of issues, maybe some kind of reading issue, then having had a head injury on top of that, and then things getting worse. So multiple neurodisabilities, complex needs. So what we found is that there was a huge amount of women in prison with these neurodisabilities and a combination of neurodisabilities. Concentration and attention were particularly high, literacy skills were low, and the social communication skills are particularly relevant because these were women often incarcerated for crimes to do with infractions in society, having arguments with a neighbor, being down the pub and getting into a kind of a verbal and then a little bit of a push and shove. So it's building up over time and getting more and more into trouble. And you kind of think, oh my God, this is somebody who needs a bit of help to manage their relationships. And we've done other work, just by the by, on brain trauma and social emotional understanding, and 30% of people with brain injury have difficulties understanding other people's expression of emotion, etc. So it's all. So the important thing here, I don't know if it's on the next one, the real important thing, apart from the profile, there was a dose-response relationship. So the more brain injury you have, the more deficits you have, which was, I think, really important. So you can see there in terms of the deficits. There's we also worked with young men as well, the larger study with young men. Then do you want to go to the next slide? So dose-response relationship and the challenges. And key thing, I just mentioned, was about this misjudging social situations, having difficulties in groups, not having interest in hobbies, having difficulty with eye contact and that sort of thing. So all the social communication stuff. So no wonder their offending patterns are quite impulsive, social type stuff. Should they be in prison? Oh, and hang on, what was their injuries due to? Domestic violence. Oh, so they're traumatized people with communication problems being made worse by being battered and then ending up in a prison system. It's not good, is it? And another huge aspect of it was when we looked at this population again, a quarter had no neurodisability issues, a quarter had maybe a bit of a mild issue, and then a quarter had some, and a quarter had lots. So if you compare the ones who had no issues, 15% of them had tried to kill themselves at some point. 15% had tried to kill themselves at some point. When you look at the ones with the multiple complex needs, 70% plus had tried to kill themselves. Not just had thought I should kill myself, but actually tried to kill themselves at some point. So it's super vulnerable. And you can imagine it's kind of being dysexecutive. It's kind of not having a memory of what's going on, future thinking not great, and the sense of hopelessness. It's really shouldn't be in prison. Anyway, sorry. Next slide. So that again, it's looking at a little bit more about the co-occurrence of these sort of problems in various issues. And you can see if you're in neurorehabilitation, you can say, right, okay. So we can help people with attention, help people with communication, and obviously help people with literacy skills. So on to the next one. Yeah, and that's fine. And next. Okay. Right. So it's just a bit this overview. This is a paper we wrote a couple of years ago. It's in Lancet Psychiatry, and it's an overview of the area. So if people are particularly interested, they can have a read of that. And it does make the point that there's a lack of research around women who end up in the criminal justice system. There's emerging work, but I think one of the themes is, oh my God, really, is this where people should be?
Wow, that's amazing research and such important research to be doing, because though everybody's suffering from that in that situation, they're all together with each other. So there's no role models for other ways out. if you were to have resources and power to change the system, how would you change it? Could you freeze? Let's give him a second. I think he froze there. Just going to read the questions. Yes, I can share the PowerPoints with you. The PowerPoints actually is already on the website. Did we lose Huw?
Catherine, I was just going to say that I think Huw sometimes has quite poor connection where he is, so hopefully he'll come back on in a second. But during some of this research, one of the really key qualitative points that sort of came up from discussions is that because there are fewer women in prisons, the women often end up getting housed really far away from their families, and that adds another level of trauma in that they can't have regular family visits, and the family contact is much lower. So hopefully Huw will come back on in a minute, but that's just like another level of trauma that was coming out of some of the qualitative talks that we were having with prison officers and things about the issues facing women in prison.
Well, I'd love you to have to can you turn your video on?
I can, yes. Hello.
Hey.
Hello.
Hi. I hope. Hi.
Hi,
Okay.
Huw.
Hey, how you doing?
Hope
So yeah,
was
thank you. Sorry, I lost you all there, but wonderfully we had Hope on hand.
Yeah, Hope jumped in and was talking about the difference with women, the fewer women and being housed further away from their family. So you have even less of a thing.
And that then traumatizes the family, right? And then you have kids who are not then getting to have time with their mums, and the fragmentation in families and so on and so forth. It's a massive social issue, one way or another. But I guess with the Disability Trust and the Do It Profile research and so on, these organizations are driving some interesting changes around a better understanding of the issues. That one of the changes happening here in the UK at the moment is that the Home Office, which is in charge of policing, has decided to take more seriously, maybe for the first time, put into their training requirements for police forces to look at domestic violence survivors and people with intimate partner violence having brain injury. So that I think Hope might have been talking about our police studies that we're currently running. So we're working with police forces in Devon and Cornwall and so on to increase the amount of knowledge they have so they can understand why somebody might be not able to follow what's being asked of them, maybe having difficulty with impulse control or not remembering the conditions of an order, and then being able to put in more support, so more sensitive sort of support.
Was there any, did you look at race in any of these studies? And from the American system, we just have such a high proportion of Black and brown people in prison. When so was that looked at as an issue in? It
doesn't pop out in the necessarily in some of the issues in the women who have been incarcerated in the Do It Profile study in Scotland. In general terms, yes, it's an issue, especially younger. Especially in some of our urban centres. So in London, for example, in the 14 to 18-year-old group, we have a significant overrepresentation of young men who are Black and from ethnic minority backgrounds. And there are a number of factors there to do with the social hostility. We had a previous Home Secretary who thought it was a good thing to try to how to put this, put the frightness on people to leave the country for a while. You know, it's not good, is it? And so we, you know, there's these are issues that constantly need to be looked at, I think.
We're at our Q&A time, and when Huw and I usually schedule an hour, we usually talk for 2, so you can see how interesting he is to listen to, you know. And we're gonna have Hope on, and we're gonna do a whole show on Hope. Because I Hope, and I just Hope also does on the domestic Violence Task Force, Hope does the Hope's Notes, which is the summary, which are fantastic. So a lot of the reason stuff gets up is because Hope it does a lot of work for us. So thank you, Hope. So there's a question up there, and I also, so, you know, if this is an intergenerational issue where you have young people going in brain injury, prison, they'll get out, be out long enough to maybe start a family with someone, have a child, then you have a child being raised, you have a cycle here. And especially in domestic violence, we know in that situation where a woman is abused, there's a 50% chance the child's being abused too. I mean, where do you think where do you, from your view, where do you start to try to break some of the cycles for some of those people?
Oh, that's a very good point. I mean, it's I guess the long-term strategy is to put in place more trauma-informed services at the earliest point around individuals at risk. And that's a very sensitive issue because you don't want to identify somebody at risk and then scoop them up into the wrong kind of system. So there's nothing like contact with the police to increase the chances of being criminalized. There's a study on twins. If one twin happens to have contact with the police at age between 7 and 9, that's Terry Moffat's work, then just a bit of a brush with the law just isn't good for you long term, one way or another. So how do we try to deal with this? Well, I think better interagency working. In the UK, where we're working at is to look at more strategic interlinking. So this may sound terribly boring, but I think it's important. We just get people to be more aware of earlier points of intervention. And support around parents and kind of an early point as well, and picking up on whether there's domestic violence is an indicator that this is going to escalate likely, right? So something needs to be done sooner. And how does that sooner happen? So with some of the projects we have in Devon and Cornwall was to support the programs, integrated offender management programs and other programs to try to reduce the chances that people will continue to offend. And at some point start to look at some of the more violent offenders as well, to then have more work in supporting the victims of violence, to bring in more change in those kind of family systems. It's creating more of a therapeutic kind of outreach work by the police in some ways. The police here would say that 60% of their work is with vulnerable populations. So they're secret social service, and it's very different around the world, isn't it? What the police are trying to do in different places. So it's about building that capacity up. So, for example, in one area, we're working to improve how schools, mental health services for children, community resources that are linked to the police but are not the police, in housing, in drug and kind of work and so on, will be alerted to that issues are escalating so you can intervene earlier. And that's data driven. So Hope, for example, is doing some studies, hopefully in time, looking at how you can aggregate some of that data. You can know, okay, well, someone's 12, 13 over here, they're at risk. And therefore need to intervene, but that intervention needs to be supportive and engaging and keep them in school. One of the things that keeps popping up, and I find it absolutely reprehensible, is school failure. Right? Our schools are under a huge amount of pressure. Teachers under lots of pressure, and we should be funding schools effectively to help kids, so that there's rehabilitation of and enablement in schools effectively. So one of the things that we did, sorry, a bit of a long tangent, was because the question you'll be asked at some point is, where's the money for that? Where's the money for that? You can't be kind of, there's no magic money tree, especially in times of austerity and all the rest of it. Well, I was asked exactly that kind of question in a parliamentary meeting by governors of prison, saying, well, if we assess everyone with a brain injury, well, they've all got brain injury. What's the point of that? And anyways, and I said, well, the thing is, yes, there's so many who do, and that's where your violence comes from, because you're not addressing their needs effectively. If you address their needs more effectively, then they wouldn't be, having so much violence. So you know what you're dealing with. People not following instructions or whatever it is. So the same thing. And they went, oh yeah, good point. You understand the population a bit better. And in this context, it's, well, why aren't we then did the economic analysis, a head injury, a brain injury in a kid of 15 in the UK on average costs £95,000, health costs, education costs, carer costs, all that kind of stuff, £95,000. Because the risk of crime is so elevated after brain injury, you add another £65,000 to that cost. So actually the cost is 150,000. So if you prevent brain injury, if you support kids after brain injury, if you enable people, then they'd be less likely to go on down an offending track, and that would save you money. Interestingly, our current cabinet minister, effectively a deputy prime minister, Michael Gove, has been signaling. I had a meeting with him when he was Secretary of State for Justice, and he seemed to get it, and that they're looking at how can we integrate systems a bit better, education, health, justice, so that we intervene earlier and save money down the line. What I keep hearing in meetings I'm in is, well, it's hard to just make change on the moral case. You have to have the economic case. Right then, okay, here's the economic case for you. Save money down the line. More taxpayers.
And do you think that COVID, so we've now had a year over here where so many of the kids haven't been in school.
Yeah.
And the delay, the kids that most badly needed to be in school weren't, and the kids that
it's
had,
super vulnerable. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you see? How do you see COVID playing into, what's it going to look like, over the next couple of years because of this, two-year break these kids will have out of school?
Yeah, I don't know. Other people's contexts and countries and states are responding in various ways, and it depends on what capacity people have. But here, linking the politics to what's needed is interesting. We have a Conservative Party that's now seeing that government has to take action, because in the past there would have been small government and let's private enterprise, answer this. But now they're seeing Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, is actually seeing that we had to have government, grasping the nettle around COVID. A bit late in the day, but they did it, and we got the drugs to defeat it and all the rest of it. So I guess another big issue here in the UK context is we need to make sure that the rebuild better actually happens. Yeah. It's going to cost us probably the estimates are at 1.5 trillion pounds to put into into boosting our systems, education, health, and all the rest of it. But it's needed, and at historic low interest rates times. By the way, everybody, I'm not a financial advisor. It's probably a good time to do that, and so that's one of the issues long term is kind of having a proper plan over the next 5 to 10 years. Because there's lots of kids who are super vulnerable because they're in families that have been particularly affected, especially families in the UK, Black and ethnic minority families where there's been more losses to COVID. There's been more hits from COVID and more precariousness in terms of employment and so on. So the hits are greater. Oh, hello, different thing.
I wanted to show one thing. So, so on your PowerPoint.
Oh, right. Yes.
On your PowerPoint, if we're just looking at this one slide.
Yep.
We were talking about this earlier. I have learning disabilities. I have dyslexia. Yep. I do have an auditory processing disorder, which is probably a communication disorder. I have ADHD. No, I've never been said I'm on the spectrum by anyone that actually had license to say that, but I've had a traumatic brain injury, no epilepsy, and my mother was in a research study in the wild 60s where you couldn't drink or smoke, and so I'm 4 or 5 on that list. Yep. But the difference is I was privileged. I was born into a white, privileged, middle-class family. Yep. We had health insurance, and I had a mother who had the privilege to stay home, and she was an English teacher of special ed's kids. So, there was a lot of, every time I did my homework, it went to mom, who went through, and I went back and did it over. And, I had this steering. And plenty of times in school, I got the, why aren't you like the other, girls, and why are you rowdy? And I know in high school, at one point, they searched my locker for drugs. They thought I was because I'm hyper, like that. I didn't look like the other girls. So, I think the difference so much is, if you take these disabilities and you have the privilege to be born in a healthy, non-toxic environment with stable people to help you through, and you have these disabilities and you're born in an environment that may be polluted, that you have one family member who doesn't have the resources, who has to work a full-time job, like it really is where you land.
That is the truth of it in so many ways, because as I was mentioning in context of my sister, I suppose, I mean it depends so much on the microculture you land yourself in, a communitarian spirited kind of can-do attitude and all the rest of it, lots of love and affection, attachment, all that kind of stuff. Of course, lots of challenges, but that'll help you. And you're absolutely right. We should have systems. Our systems have historically failed kids with and young people and women with neurodisability. And I've been a bit. You probably have seen me agitated about this in various conferences where I do work in sports concussion. I do work actually with military. I do work in all kinds of areas, but I get really annoyed that there's a lack of research on intimate partner violence, and it's actually quite, it's like, it's in there. So it's kind of, we need to visualize the issue so then it can be planned for. And so part of that is the support systems and in a way that is acceptable to people. I mean, it's hard for people who need help to actually accept that help, because it may feel as if it's something that's being imposed upon rather than that is something that you're asking for, and in your own context. So we have to build systems that are sensitive, led by people who know what the two issues are, but also in a collaborative way. The parenting thing is key. Time and time again, what are the best predictors or best outcomes for brains and society and well-being and all the rest of it? And it's to do with early parenting. It's to do with adolescence parenting. Obviously, very different kind of things. The different kind of skill sets you need as the parent in adolescence, right? But they evolve. So parenting is key at different points, and enabling the right kind of context for people to thrive. Brian Kolb's work is fantastic in that area. Brian Kolb, a Canadian neuroscientist, on the brain side of things and what's good for brain development. And at the basic level, what I've also said to many governors, and one of the things that they seem to take on board, is that the kids who end up in the prison systems have fight or flight system just raring all the time, right? And that's not good for your brain. Cortisol isn't good for your brain on a constant basis. So you need to have something that's more positive for brain development. So no wonder they end up being agitated. No wonder they're impulsive, because they're on fight or flight all the time. Nobody's been reading a story to them and kind of going like you probably had as a kid, someone having the time because they got the other job to do and everything else and the other kid. And so reading a story, all that kind of all those positive parenting stuff are really critically vital. And I think that society, is at risk sometimes of being atomizing too much and not enabling our in various forms, the ways in which we can create families these days is a beautiful thing.
I could go on talking with you for so long. I do want to give a chance, and I'll open the floor. And if somebody has a question for Huw, we have about 10 or 15 more minutes. I'm going to read through the questions in the chat. I know Cara's been reading through them. So who would like to ask Huw a question?
I have a question, Catherine.
Hi, Ramesh. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Lovely to see you.
Nice to be here too. This is a great session. Thanks a lot, Huw, for your information. So I work on TBI, but more from the animal model perspective. We have been working on models of pediatric TBI for a number of years, and one of the things that we've been working on for the last 5 years is this particular, what you just said, which is the response of the brain to stressful situations when the animals have aged into adolescence after having sustained a brain injury earlier in life. And what we find, actually, to the last point you just made, is that when they do face a stressful situation, the cortisol goes up,
Right.
But what happens is that at the cellular level within multiple regions of the brain, the
Yeah.
response to the cortisol is impaired. So
Oh.
it's not so much just the exposure to it goes up and comes down just like in normal animals.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Okay.
the
Yeah.
fact is that at the cellular level, so
Yeah.
we think that, for example, is, you need a basal level of
Yeah.
cortisol
For
for
motivation.
normal functioning.
Yeah, you do.
But
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
happens in a stress situation is that the signaling that the cortisol does is impaired. So these animals can't respond
Yeah.
to even quote unquote normal situations.
Yeah.
And so we think that it might be more a focus of trying to fix that. And there's actually, we just got funding from the Brain Injury Association of America to test a novel compound that
Okay.
should in principle facilitate the efficient signaling of the cortisol in the brain. So
That's fascinating. Thank you for that. I would love to hear more about it, because we have because obviously these are populations in human terms also would have been in chronic stress conditions, and the lovely work at Harvard around early trauma and brain development links into this quite well, and the inflammatory response, and what's the best ways in which you can then create the best environment for adaptive plasticity in adolescence is vital, absolutely vital. So thank you. That's fascinating. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I'd like to, Aisha Francis, would you like to speak? I met Aisha's daughter on Camila, and we've been running groups on Clubhouse. I'm trying to get everybody on Clubhouse. And I know, Aisha, would you like to unmic and say any thoughts that you have?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think it's a vitally important conversation, one that I am immersed in often because of the work that I do with families impacted by incarceration. And I would have to agree. I think that there's quite a bit of a divide or a miss in looking at individuals who are in the system that are dealing with TBIs or ABIs. There's quite a bit of trauma that is happening in these situations. I've worked with many people who have acquired their brain injury while being incarcerated because of some of the violence that has been in there, and or have entered into the system because of their brain injuries, or to what you had spoken to earlier, are exiting the system and being reincarcerated because of their brain injury. They're not following through on some of the administrative stuff that they need to do after in the system. And so, I don't think that we have a really robust response on how to work with individuals who have acquired brain injuries. I don't know that they are effectively screening for individuals that are either entering or exiting the system and or providing the appropriate supports. So that's a really big part of the conversation that is happening on a small degree in Canada, but certainly an area of focus for my organization. And providing also the resources for family members who become the hub for those who are reintegrating, right? They reintegrate mostly into their family initially. And so providing the family with the supports that they need to rebuild the supports, but also the relationship and the communication and conflict resolution that needs to happen at a family level before we then support them into the further broader reintegration into their communities and society and different social institutions that they need to be a part of. The last thing I'll say really briefly, we have similar costs over here for incarcerated folks, over 100 grand for men, closer to 200,000 for females. Where women are concerned is also a big concern because they don't have, while they're incarcerated, they also don't have the same supports that a lot of the men do. Men will have partners, mothers, other family
female supports, That's typically, yeah.
Often supporting there.
Yep.
We see the women that are incarcerated a lot.
Nobody.
No, because their parents usually take on their responsibilities of caring for their children, step into those roles, and so they are taxed to a degree. A lot of the partners of women will not stay because it is challenging, and they, whatever reason, decide to leave, move on to new relationships. And so that is another area. I mean, we work with all families, but we certainly do put an emphasis on supporting women who are impacted by incarceration, whether they are directly involved in the system or are the partner of someone who's in the system, because roundabout, they are disproportionately forgotten, if I can use that language, as we talk about.
I think that was wonderfully put, and really lovely examples of what needs to happen. I loved what you said about the hub and the conflict resolution and who supports the supports effectively. In the UK, what's happening, this may be helpful, is that we're having discussions at a national level about there's inquiries into how to improve outcomes. So the police, probation, prison, National Health Service, justice, so that we can improve screening for brain injury in courts, so that in and in coming into prison and on the way out. So there's key workers, link workers. So we did a proof of concept of link workers and so on. So it's all kind of going along, and sometimes it fits and starts, but it's going along, and I'm happy to come back at some point to give it a little overview where we're up to in a few months' time, because we're getting quite large scale service arrangements happening where there's collaboration between in the system, and so the individual in the end has a better support system and technologically provided for with apps and so on that will then help them to manage themselves in the community more effectively and so on. So it's kind of a long and short of it, because we see that it's a way of addressing the cost. And another a kind of vital aspect in the whole scheme is just sort of, we keep hearing awareness, but turning that awareness into action and protocols and making that systemic. And I think that's really important. On the female front, absolutely. I think you're spot on. I mean, who looks after the system? That's a vital area. I've been involved with something called the Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty, United Nations invited study on children worldwide who end up in prisons, incarcerated because their parents are incarcerated in detention centers on the borders of various countries, or orphanages, or wherever they are, the UN Global Study. And there's a chapter in that overall UN report on women and family, because women are typically, not always, but typically hold that function in societies around keeping it all together effectively. And that links to another UN initiative that we were involved with, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So 130 odd countries are signed up to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was updated to effectively say now that there are far too many kids with neurodisabilities ending up in prison systems. And their needs need to be addressed more effectively, but they shouldn't be there in the first place, which is the cool thing, because that then gives you legal bite in whatever jurisdiction you're in to go, well, hang on, you were signed up to an international legal framework here. And a nice example of that is that Nathan, who was particularly helped with, and Bethany Claspy is working on in New Zealand, is on the New Zealand judiciary adopted Judge Beecroft, who headed the New Zealand judiciary for kids, saw our table on how many kids with neurodisability come through, and decided that they are banging up too many kids with neurodisability. That's just and so they put in a call for being able to screen and more effectively manage and provide more restorative justice in the community. And with restorative justice in the community, you get much more buy-in in your community, and you keep people together, and also you address the issues in a way that people can learn from. And their levels of incarceration of kids have just gone down, and that's used by the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disability as a model system. So one element of what we're aiming towards, with Catherine may have mentioned, is that towards 2022 in New York, we're hoping between the IBIA UNICEF and UN Office of Drugs and Crime to have more of a sense of what do we do across different kinds of states, high income states like ours here in the UK, mid and low income states, to try to provide better sources and resources and services around kids and people with brain injury, but also the family system within which, of course, the parent is key. So yeah.
Anisha, I just wanted to let you have a chance to say the name of the director. You're the founder and director of Restore Phoebe, Families Impacted by Incarceration.
Yes, Restore Phoebe. Yeah, Families Impacted by Incarceration. I'll put it in the chat. So
Thank you very much.
Great. And my first group in Clubhouse with her daughter, Isha, came in and supported us. So it was great to have, when you open your first room in Clubhouse, have a bunch of family jump in. So I've been adopted by their family. It's the 3 o'clock hour. For those of you that have to go, I did want to make a quick mention that the World Brain Injury, the Virtual World Congress will be on July 22nd, 2021. Actually, no, that's NICS. That's NICS. So, okay. So the Virtual World Congress on Brain Injury is going to be in the last weekend in July on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And if you like what we're talking about today, Huw is coming back. Jocelyn, I'm going to tell her that tomorrow. We have a whole crew coming to talk about domestic violence, prison systems, families, and pull together the UN pieces that Huw was talking about. So we'll have about 4 or 5 hours. So if you like that, sign up for that pre-conference. We'll be having that out soon. And then Nick, did you want to give a pitch? Because it's deadline for Australia, right?
Yeah, so as a pleasant prelude to attending the International Brain Injury Association conference at the end of July, Brain Injury Australia's 8th National Brain Injury Conference will be held at the University of Sydney between July 20th and 22nd of July. Now, given the fact that Australia's almost reached elimination of COVID-19, attendance, unfortunately, will need to be, as it were, in person. However, presentation can be virtual from anywhere in the world in your pajamas. The deadline for abstracts is today, Australia's today. So, but I'll allow people to sneak in an abstract or two via email to me directly. But if you go to braininjuryconference.com.au, you'll find all the instructions necessary to submit an abstract.
I've always hated March as a month to travel around and do brain injury. So I think we just shift brain injury month to July. It's a much nicer month to travel. So I want to thank you, Huw. I want to thank you, Huw, and those that have to drop off because I know it's the hour. We did start a little late, thanks to my doggos. Does anybody else, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, sure. I've got time.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to?
I'll.
Hello, Nick. Yep. Nice to see you.
Hi, Huw. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Lovely to see you.
It's unfortunately my boring standard casting around question, right, which is: do you know of any dementia researchers on your patch with an interest in TBI as a risk factor, specifically those the result of domestic and family violence? I don't know. Yeah. I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in Australia, there is, for reasons I can't quite understand, reluctance, downright resistance to considering this as a risk factor for dementia. It's a little bit too difficult, too unsavory, too challenging, too confronting to discuss this with women who may be part of prospective cohort studies.
Well, I share your frustration with, in some ways, Nick. There is two things. We've more recently started doing work looking at the issues for women who've had a concussion in rugby, for example, so sports concussions and so on. And I keep thinking, and can we now try to get people in the domestic violence area interested? but then and then get things moving and so on. So Alicia Smith has been doing some lovely work here. Alicia is my colleague here in Exeter and Bristol, who works in dementia and in domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and is a great colleague, and we should have her on here at some point. Less already. And the other person, so we, in terms of domestic violence as a factor in the brain injury being kind of had, there's scant information on that, unfortunately. There is Clive Ballard, again, Exeter University, is a neuropsychiatrist with large-scale data sets looking at factors that could influence dementia, and recently published a review, a large-scale meta-analytic review of risks of dementia post-TBI, and a very good review. So, and brain injury is a risk factor for dementia, and I'm not going to talk about other forms of dementia in that kind of context. Oh, maybe I should. Okay, CTE, which is like, a whole thing in and of itself that's full of intrigue and a lack of clarity and all that kind of stuff. And I wish I could have had the chat with Willie last week.
We had
anyway.
last week, yeah.
Yeah. So, but in any case, having multiple brain traumas is not good for your brain long term. In terms of potential risk of dementia, and Clive Ballard's recent review is pretty good on that. But picking up on intimate partner violence as a risk factor in that, I'm not so sure if there's even the data on that. But I would love to know if there was. We're kind of coming at this engineering issue backwards by going, look, these people seem to be in prison. Why? Do they have disorders of personality? Yeah, because their brains were changed at a relatively young age. They have dysexecutive syndromes. So it's we're kind of trying to re-engineer society in a kind of a kind of backwards kind of way. But then pointing it, I feel sometimes I'm kind of going around saying, look, this is obvious, isn't it? Come on, do something about it. So we do need to have better quality data that would and sensitively gathered and all that kind of stuff. Sorry, Nick, that's a long answer, but nice to see you. And you've done some lovely work in this area. Thank you for doing years ago, and you're helping out a lot. Thank you. Yeah. Ta.
Eric,
Everybody.
Did Eric want to say something?
Oh.
Eric, you're off mic. Did you want to say something?
You talking to me?
Yeah, you were off mic.
Right.
Did you want to say something?
Well, now.
Yeah, you're on now. You want to say
Hey,
something?
it's good seeing everybody.
Hi.
Thank you very much. Yeah. No, I got there a little bit late, but I certainly appreciate the whole conversation and everything. And thank you very much, Huw. I appreciate it.
That's fine. Thank you.
I'll send you.
I was going to make a quick joke though on the deadline. That was asked for a submission. That's coming from Australia. So is there a time lag? there?
Gone already, you think?
Yeah. So anyway, since the deadline was today.
Yeah.
And I do appreciate the men on the call. So often I'm at women empowering women, empowering female veterans, events that you're in a room of basically all women. And I think it's all these issues are going to take men and women across the spectrum to really make lasting change. So I appreciate the men that would, a topic, brain injury and trauma in women in prisons, a pretty small subset of people, how they want to spend their, an hour on their Thursday or Friday morning for Nick. So I really appreciate it. One more question, and then we'll let Huw get back to his daughter's birthday.
Fair enough. I did have some champagne earlier, but with her for breakfast. So it's dissipated by now. Need to top up.
I would like to. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go on.
I would like to say thank you for acknowledging that intimate partner violence is definitely got to be factored in. And I want to thank Catherine for saying, yes, the man on the call, props.
We have some great men, and I always say that Pink Concussions is where it is. I mean, women have been supporting behind everything we've ever done, but the big doors have been opened by men. because men had access to the places we need to have events. Men had the chance, wrote checks when they could, and men put their names behind our names. And so, I always believe that, every movement has to be inclusive of all groups. So we may be called a women's organization, but very happy to have the men that we have on these calls. So, Cara, did you want to ask a question, and then we'll let Huw get back to his holiday?
I was just looking at the questions that were written in, and one from Barb Winters is asked, when you talk of the effect on families, is there recognition of how to break the cycle of generations of families being incarcerated? So if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So that is comes back to something I mentioned earlier, I guess, is the more systemic kind of look in a sensitive way about the issues. So there's the cycles of violence issue is so influenced by social inequalities and access to services and supports and all the rest of it, and depending where you are in the world. So it's about, in many ways, enabling better, more sensitive kind of systems. As I keep saying, it's kind of difficult to do that without then being an agent from outside of someone's sphere of comfort, I suppose. But it's really important to try to engage with families. In one set of studies in London, it was possible to show that you can break transgenerational violence in young men through brief forms of psychotherapy to manage anger and irritability, not in brain injury, but in young men who had become fathers. And there's probably an element of you need to have a multi-system approach to it. And that multi-system approach needs to be properly funded, not kind of something for like this year or next year by a politician kind of wanting to just, it needs to be properly planned for society, because lots of the issues are risk factors for having brain injuries and trauma and violence and the rest of it are endemic issues about social inequalities fundamentally. We did a study here in the UK that showed that in under 5-year-olds, under 5-year-olds are actually at very high risk of having a brain injury. They're the other big risk group apart from the adolescents, and there's both boys and girls. Girls under 5 are as at risk of having a moderate severe brain injury as boys at age 3 or 4. And and if you compare across socioeconomic groups, it's the poorest 5% of the kids under 5 who are the most at risk. So it's the poorest 5% who are 5 times more likely under 5 to be to have a brain injury. So 5. So we need to look at social inequalities. We need to look at support systems around families. We need to look at how we can shore up that people aren't living in precarious environments and situations, and that's across the board. So it's not an easy fix, and that's why I'm pleased that there's a there we go. I'm pleased that there's a more joined up thinking happening in some services. The issue on male and female head injury in adolescence is also changing. There's more binge drinking in girls and young women. A recent study in Norway showing kind of the girls are catching up in terms of injuries, and how much of this is to do with reporting as well. So these are trends we need to constantly be looking at. And there's providing family support to people who need it in a way that they can receive is a vital aspect, so they don't feel they're being. We had some really good social systems and support in the UK a few years ago, but they were cut away, unfortunately, with a change in political parties coming in. So short start programs and all the rest of it. So the answer to your question is rather long, but it is about social change, and brain injuries is one of the indicators of social inequalities, and the big one, and it leads to further social inequalities.
And
I always-
healthcare inequity and inequity in access to care, and then it's just
Absolutely.
from diagnosis to treatment to every aspect,
Every other
along
aspect.
the pathway to care.
Yep.
I always show that slide, but that is ER visits for families that had, for people that had access to an ER. I mean, to go to our ER is $1,200. You walk across the threshold, they pan you an ice bag, it's $1,200. So those are people that were hurt enough to be taken in for that type of thing. And they know from statistics that you have you have an 80% chance of being taken in for a head injury when it is in a sporting event, but 50-50 if it's in your backyard or, on a local playground where your parent hasn't seen, it hasn't been a sort of a public accident. So did you want to say something else, Huw?
No, I was just thinking, if you look at, all our societies have different ways of trying to address the health kind of issues. And, in French society, there's insurance schemes that then in the end kind of effectively work as a national health service in the same way as we do. Most European countries have these sort of systems. One way or another, the Australian system is interesting. That's a kind of a hybrid system. The US system, frankly, from the outside, it's I feel sad about it because you see so much poverty being heaped up upon poverty when there's a health issue, and I don't know what the current plans are, but anyway, sorry, it's just that there's at the same time, it depends what the current administrations are focused upon as their main
And what
strategy.
end of the spectrum you're on. I mean, I was born into having great health insurance. I got divorced out of health insurance. I didn't have health insurance while I had cancer, and then I'm back paying for my own. And my care has been completely different depending on which of those periods I was in. Well, we're way over. I knew that would happen. It's always fun to talk to you. If you like what we're talking about today, we're going to have 4 or 5 hours. It was some great speakers to open the World Congress. We're going to call it's called PinkX. So sign up. Oh, here's Hugh's childhood picture.
Yeah, there you go. That's my dad.
That's Hugh's dad. Tell us. It's a Japanese guide. Tell us what it was translated as.
Oh yeah, me and my brothers. In his lap sits his hopes for the future. So there you are.
Well, with hope for the future, that's a
and there you go, Hope.
But Hope. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe. We'll see you next week. Thank you, Huw. Thank you, Hope. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Pleasure. Bye-bye.